Welcome to the Social Media Conference 2016. It's a very big pleasure for us to have you and for you to be part of the discussion that we are going to be having today. We have different panels. We're going to really be discussing social media and how it's enhancing our social lives, but also political lives. My name is Solomon Serwanja. I'm going to be your host for the first session, but most also I'm going to be the moderator for the opening session. Well, social media has become an integral part of our modern society. Literally all of us, many people in urban places have smartphones, and technology is advancing actually. Those days you used to take a picture, then rush back to office on your desktop, download that picture and perhaps put it up online. This time, you just take a photo and boom, it's all over. And everyone retweets and tweets. Facebook, we share on WhatsApp. And before you know it, it's going viral, attracting both national and international attention, depending on what you're putting on social media. Well, just to get some facts right, according to the Uganda Communications Commission, about 14 million Ugandans use the internet. Surprising statistics because they vary. Well, to just get your views and opinions.
Because they will open up completely new perspectives for us. So we have an ambitious program, a long day ahead of us. But I am sure the setup and the hotel in the background and all the service providers will make sure we are comfortable throughout. We are all around and available. If you have any questions, please attend to any of our staff. They were supposed to wear badges, but they were stolen from us last night. But you will see, you will always find someone to talk to. One question that already came up, and that's the last thing I'm going to mention now, but you will see me again later with some administrative remarks. People were asking about internet access. There should be fast internet here. Serena has made sure they boost the access here and increase the bandwidth so that all of you can be online. Sometimes it can be a bit difficult with your own mobile internet in a hall like this. So you log in to the Open Serena internet, you start your browser and you will get to the Serena website, and that's where you enter the voucher number, which is the one we displayed also at the registration desk, which is 19 capital A, capital D, capital H. 19 capital A, capital D, capital H. And I hope it's all gonna work out. Otherwise, please notify us so that we can work on it. Once again, a warm welcome all of you, and I really look forward to both the input from the wonderful and many panelists that we have, but also from you in the audience. Thank you.
Matthias Kamp, thank you very much for the opening remarks. We certainly are looking forward to a brighter day. And again, ladies and gentlemen, it's going to be a presentation. We'll have discussions, we'll hear from you, and we will be debating social media today. I want to officially invite our Daniel Karinaki. Now, Daniel is the managing editor of the Nation Media Group based in Nairobi, Kenya, celebrated journalist. He has mentored many of us, and he has inspired.
Having a conversation. I'd planned to kind of needle him a little. I'd like to thank the organizers for putting this conference in place. I think social media, Boazizi, the humble market vendor, his desperate self-immolation, and the subsequent uprisings that swept from power entrenched regimes in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, and changed the Arab world in fundamental ways. In their study on social media and the Arab Spring, three scholars led by Gadi Walsfeld provide a theoretical framework that is instructive and which I borrow from. Their first premise is that we cannot understand the role of social media in collective action without first taking into account the political environment within which they operate. The second premise is that a significant increase in the use of new media is much more likely to follow a significant amount of protest activity than to precede it. Now let's try to localize these theoretical frameworks to our reality in Uganda. And I propose to test them against three major forms of popular protest: the September 2009 Kayunga or Uganda riots, the walk-to-work protests in 2011, and the popular actions around and following the 2016 elections. But first, a disclaimer. Social media are still relatively new in Uganda as we make our slow, tentative progress towards mid-row income status. And there's insufficient data or scholarship on which to build concrete arguments. For instance, although Twitter, seen as one of the key mobilizational tools, has been around since March 2006, by the time of the Kayunga riots, for instance, it was hardly a medium of note in Uganda. In fact, last night I had to check and was rather relieved to learn that I had joined it a few months before the riots. Yet this allows us to use the Kayunga riots as a control mechanism in these social needs, the emergence overnight of modern day kings and princes laying claim to ancient lands and grievances. Yet when the violence broke out, it was arguably spontaneous and spread in a manner that remains instructive. Reports of protests and violence were reported primarily by traditional media, in particular radios that were broadcasting in Uganda, including CBS Radio, fanning new protests and violence in other areas. That's an important distinction, that protests preceded the media coverage that then perhaps brought more people into the protests. Many people try to, and I think the controversy over the closure of CBS Radio seemed to suggest that the protests. So here we have one protest, but let's look at the protest. The parliament in Uganda action was ripe for protest. Apart from the disaffection some felt with the election outcome, the ruins of the Kasubi tombs still smoldering in the minds of others, the rising cost of living created by the election expenditure, created fertile ground for grievances culminating into the walk-to-work protests. The first protest, the Kayunga of Uganda, was spontaneous, but not entirely unexpected, while the second had a more formal organization, but was also fueled, at least initially, by reports of protests feeding through the media to give birth to more protests. So you had one day people coming out into the streets, that being reported, and then the next day more people coming into the streets. Again, the cycle of protests, media, then more protests being repeated. It is possible, but not entirely guaranteed, that greater access to social media could have in their tools. And if you look at very violent Kayunga protests, then you have less violent walk-to-work protests, and then you have another election cycle where you have pretty much not much in the way of popular protests. Here again, the Public Order Management Bill had restored wide-ranging powers to the police to control law and order that critics argue gave legal cover to undue restrictions to the constitutional freedoms of expression, association, and political assembly. The government had also literally closed the physical space for protests by sealing off the constitutional square in Kampala, as well as the ceremonial grounds in Kololo, which remain, to the best of my knowledge, to this day, under armed guard. And I'm sure the same is true for public spaces in other parts of the country. This tactic had precedence in the Arab world in the wake of the protests there. In Egypt, and where there were protests that weren't successful in dislodging the regime, King Hamad had dug up the power roundabout that protesters had previously rallied around and erected a traffic light junction instead. So when you go past Kalere roundabout or Busega roundabout and you see these monstrous police vehicles, there is actually a precedence of occupying those spaces. The immediate implication of this is that even as more and more Ugandans get access to social media and the collaborative network effects it offers, they have less and less physical or legal room in which to organize protests and demand for change. The more you know, the less you're able to do anything about it, beyond liking, retweeting, and tagging. A quick discourse analysis of a sample of social media channels in Uganda reveals social and political dilemmas. The furor over the broken cancer machine at Mulago Hospital, for instance, or over bad roads and other daily gripes, shows the inability of public institutions to quickly adjust government programs and policies and to the demands of the people. Politically, it reveals evidence of what scholars term the cultural incongruence hypothesis. This cyber impotence is more pronounced when the government chooses to pull the plug on social media whenever it feels threatened by citizen anger and is unable to mobilize sufficient intellectual bandwidth to provide a coherent counter-argument. It is also evident that the protests we see are not only predominantly in urban and peri-urban areas, but also within the lower income neighborhoods, far removed, if I may say, from the cappuccino-sipping Twitterati, who are more likely to use the internet for entertainment and to keep in touch with friends. I would like to recommend at this point to those who are scholarly inclined to try and map during a protest, to try and see to do an overlay map of Uganda and see where the tweets are coming from. My suspicion is that you won't have very many tweets coming from Kawempe or Rukunjiri or the places where you actually have the protests. So you have a disconnect between where people are actually protesting and where people are talking about the protests. The second premise, that a significant increase in the use of new media is much more likely to follow a significant amount of protest activity than to precede it, is also evident in the two recent incidents of the government pulling the plug on social media, where the response wasn't a march in the streets by angry citizens demanding to have access restored, but a surge in downloads of virtual private networks to bypass the blockade. So you have protests, then you have a blockade, then you have more people actually joining social media and finding ways to bypass the blockade. The conventional wisdom is that it's the other way around, that people join, encourage protests, and then the government comes in to blockade it. The evidence doesn't support that theory. This suggests that as more and more people take up protests, even civil ones in cyberspace, they will attract more and more people to join social media. This is an important lesson for those who seek to clamp down on social media. The solution is to address the causes of protests, not to throttle the medium. But for those interested in using social media to transform society, the message is clear. The authorities have taken the analog restrictions to the media space, to the traditional media space, into cyberspace. With social media, as with traditional media, citizens are playing defense, and those in power have the serve. The switching off of social media in Uganda and in other countries is pretty much the same as shutting down a newspaper. It's just that the theater of action has shifted, but the methods and the attitude and the mindset of those in power towards those who speak truth to them hasn't changed. Writing in Foreign Affairs about the political power of social media, Clay Shaki warned of the danger of politicizing the internet. For instance, with allegations of activists being funded by faceless foreign enemies, in order for non-democratic regimes to try and block access, undermining the possibility of the internet and social media building an active civil society and forging an alternative path to democratization. I'm sure my friend Nicholas Opio has had reports of him and others being funded by foreign forces to occupy this space. Indeed, while the Ugandan government has taken some positive steps towards increasing access and reducing the cost of connectivity, most of its interventions, however, have been in the general direction of controlling access or monitoring those who are active in these social networks. Let's pause here for a second to sum up the argument so far. We have seen that we cannot understand the role of social media in collective action without first taking into account the political environment within which they operate. And we've seen that a significant increase in the use of new media is much more likely to follow a significant amount of protest activity than to precede it. We have seen a negative correlation between the intensity of protests in the last decade and the growing access to social media, and have hypothesized that this is, at least in part, due to the closing down of physical spaces, the imposition of legal restrictions on protest, the resolution of some underlying factors, such as the then frosty relations between Uganda and the central government, and the clamping down on social media themselves. In other words, we have seen what transformations social media have not done. So what transformations can we see? First, as many employers will tell you, social media is the silent thief of corporate time, the crouching tiger devouring the attention of employees, the hidden dragon slicing through productivity. About 20 years ago, when I was starting out as a journalist, I remember writing an article about how it was easy to tell the relationship status of people in the morning traffic, if it was a man and a woman in the car. My theory then was that if they were talking to one another, they were still dating. If they weren't speaking to one another, they were married. These days, no one talks to anyone anymore. There's WhatsApp for that. We don't look at each other in the eye anymore. There's Instagram for that. Yet it has also provided opportunities for businesses, both big and small, to be seen and for them to have conversations with potential customers. Beyond turning us all into social misfits, have had some profound impacts on society and power relations. Social media have charted waters with hashtag #AskAmama. And regardless of whether one sees it as sheer politicking or not, the idea of an ordinary citizen asking a senior government official direct questions in public is fairly revolutionary in our society. Asking questions doesn't always get you answers, mind, at least not directly, as my friend Thomas Dumba recently discovered during hashtag #AskURA. But it is a start, and an important one. Don't get me started about AskSpay. We are still in mourning. Giving every citizen the power to publish, as social media do, is not without its problems, from violations of privacy to publication of unverified or deliberately distorted information. We used to live in a world where you didn't believe anything until the government denied it. We now live in a world where it is hard to believe anything at all. In fact, this distortion of reality and the lack of credibility in the vast social media jungle could explain why the leading social media accounts remain those associated with traditional media, which helps to maintain the dominant narrative that social media are supposed to challenge. If you check Twitter and Facebook, the accounts, the top 10 accounts with followers and influencers dominated by traditional media houses. We have also seen how social media reduce the transaction cost of mobilization and lower the cost of collective action. For instance, my friend Esther Kalenzi runs the 40 Days Over 40 Smiles nonprofit, which builds stuff for children in need. It is a fantastic little outfit with great people doing great things, but I'm constantly trying to get Esther and her friends, and annoying them in the process, to stop doing the soft, fluffy things that warm the heart and start asking the hard questions that annoy those in power, such as why the taxes we pay go to buy luxury cars for ministers and members of parliament instead of building classrooms and giving school children a warm meal. 4040, hashtag Self-Carol, and other such initiatives made possible by social media are, to be fair, imperfect responses to an imperfect terrain. But while they are altruistic, benevolent, and carried on with the best intentions, they are actually symptoms of weak, not strong citizen agency. They are evidence of us participating in the politics, not contesting it. We all know that the best response to the pathetic state of our hospitals is not to fundraise for the odd patient whose story happens to galvanize public attention, but to demand for a national health insurance scheme that works for all. Yet, social media campaigns allow us to remind ourselves of our humanity, to tithe away our social conscience, to outsource our citizen agency with a dose of mobile money. Social media are powerful tools for low-cost recruitment and fundraising, but they can also be the deceptively soothing balm that blinds us to injustice, makes us impotent to impunity. Where is the justice for Abigail, the 2-year-old shot dead by an LD in Masaka in 2011? Or for Saidi Lutaya, whose inquest remains pending almost a decade after his death? Or for the dozens of Ugandans tortured or subjected to wars by the security agencies supposed to protect them? Where do dead hashtags go? Let me now conclude with some broad brush observations. First, information wants to be free. We have seen this on the global scale with WikiLeaks, the Snowden leaks, and most recently the Panama Papers. Now, the notion of leaking official documents isn't new in and of itself, as we saw with the leakage of the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War in the United States of America. However, the nature of some of these leaks, which completely bypass the mediatory space of traditional media, is revolutionary and will be more so when and not if it starts in undemocratic and repressive states. Think for a moment what would happen if someone in the office of the IGG were to take the trove of all wealth declarations by civil servants and put them on a website. Bonanza. Secondly, several studies have shown that citizens who use the internet are more likely to demand democratic governance, although overall rates for internet penetration do not always correlate with more demand for democracy from citizens. Research suggests that internet use may play a more meaningful role in strengthening and enhancing young democracies through impacting citizen attitudes rather than promoting outright democratic transitions among autocratic regimes. Thus, social media should be seen as facilitators of protest rather than causes, spaces for enlightenment rather than dark forces for regime change. As more and more people come online in Uganda and other poorer countries with less internet penetration, more and more people will demand for better governance, rule of law, and increased accountability. Brace yourselves, I had planned to tell my friend Frank. Third, and rather sobering, is that social media are not an end in themselves. They only help transform societies where certain conditions are present, including a moderate to high level of internet penetration, some form of at least partially democratic regimes that allow the space, and a high demand from citizens for deeper democracy. It doesn't matter how many retweets you get if you don't get out and vote. Offline activism is as important, if not more, than online engagement. As we've seen with the Balai Citoyen and the Firimbi citizen movements in Burkina Faso and the Democratic Republic of Congo, respectively, mobilization can take place in the ether of cyberspace, but the real struggle must take place in the real world. In fact, the writer Malcolm Gladwell has argued that the internet is far more likely to create weak ties than the strong ties that social movement theorists argue are fundamental to the success of costly political action. It is kind of hard to go into battle with someone who you only know on Twitter, right? It's a bit different when you've actually sat down and had a conversation with someone. We must recognize the transformative power of social media, but we must neither exaggerate it nor take it for granted. It is a tool that must be harnessed, sharpened, and set against the right tasks, something conferences such as these can help us with. Let me finish on a lighter note. I decided to check out the Google Zeitgeist for Uganda for 2015. This is basically, Google does these things where they collect all the searches that have taken place across the world and different countries. So basically a summary of what Ugandans searched for most that year. Now, 2015 was one of the most politically active years. You had a falling out in the ruling party between two people who had been at the helm of the country for 3 decades. It was the year preceding a tightly contested election. Yet the top current affairs searches were about Pope Francis in Uganda. Fair enough, people are very religious and they love their God. Mama Awards, which I don't think I know very well about. Charlie Hebdo, Syria, the Burundi coup, and the Mayweather versus Manny Pacquiao boxing fight. This suggested to me that we get local news from local news sources, and thus, having no need to search for them, instead use our Google searches for global news events. After all, we're connected global citizens. So I then looked at the how-to search category. So Google breaks it down. You can search for just the topics, but you can search for the things that people search for how to do ABCD. So I went to the how-to category. Among the top 10 were such profound queries as how to calculate pregnancy months, how to join the Illuminati in Uganda, and wait for it, this one offers some food for thought, how to make mandazi. There is a lot of work to be done, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Let's give another round of applause to Daniel Kalinaki, the person we know he is. Well, when Daniel stands up to speak, he literally, leaves you speechless. And go in, changing for, forming a very firm foundation upon which our next panel will be discussing. Speaking of panel, we are going to go into our panel discussion, and we're going to invite our panelists. This morning, the first panel, of course, is going to be talking about social media, redefining the democratic space in Uganda, building bridges or building walls. I think will form a better part of our discussion on the keynote address that has been given by Daniel Kalinaki. And on that note, I want to invite our panelists. I will start with Nicholas Opio. Nicholas Opio is a leading human rights lawyer, celebrated lawyer here in Kampala. I know he doesn't like a lot of that, but you'll excuse me, Nick, I'll have to introduce you. Nicholas Opio is also the founder of the human rights organization Chapter for Uganda. He has worked tirelessly since 2005 to defend civil liberties in Uganda. Often, better part of his career he has dedicated to defending human rights in Uganda. And of course, Nicholas Opio is a celebrated, lawyer and political analyst. Nicholas Opio, if you can come and take your seats. Just to be on record, Nick doesn't want a lot of talking about him. He literally just wants to say, "I'm just a lawyer out there in town." Let's give him some love as comes. Well, I also want to invite Rosebel Kagumire. Rosebel Kagumire is a celebrated social media activist. I just follow this lady every other time. I just go on her Twitter account. She is a big name if you want to know anything going on in the world of social media. But let me just introduce her more formally rather than what I've just been speaking. Rosebel Kagumire is a multimedia content producer, is a communications specialist, is a trainer, public speaker, award-winning blogger. Ladies and gentlemen, she has worked in the Ugandan media covering political and social justice issues at the Daily Monitor, at NTV Uganda. She's one person to reckon with. Let's give her some round of applause. Well, I also want to invite Patricia Akumu. Patricia Akumu is Patience Akumu, yes. Patience Akumu is a coordinator, research and policy coordinator at Oxfam, Uganda. Now, Patience is a lawyer and an award-winning journalist who has used social media to advocate for the rights of women and sexual minorities. She has written about human rights and social justice issues for publications like The Guardian, The Observer in the UK, The Observer Uganda, and also other international news agencies there. Many thanks for joining us this morning. Well, finally, I want to invite Moses Watasa to join us also. Moses will be representing the information minister who was supposed to be here. Moses Watasa is a commissioner. Yes, he is a commissioner, and he's commissioner for information from the Directorate of National Guidance. He's also going to be joining us on the panel this morning. Let's give him some love. Again, thank you very much, our panelists, for making it this morning. Well, I'm going to be your moderator. My name is Solomon Serwanja, but you can keep the discussion going on Twitter and on Facebook. Our hashtag is Uganda Social Media. We'll be sampling some of those responses that are coming through later on. We've also put up a poll question on the Twitter accounts at KAS Uganda, at Rosebel Kagumire, at Nicholas Opio, at Patience Akuma, at Solomon Serwanja. So you can be able to be part of this discussion as we continue. Please tweet about it. We'll be able to sample some of your tweets as we continue on with the discussion. Well, the first panel we're going to be discussing under the theme, social media, redefining democratic space, building bridges or building walls. Quite a very controversial subject here. Well, from Daniel's discussion, I get one thing, that social media can also be overrated, but also shouldn't be completely undermined. If I can perhaps summarize it from the way I got it, I may be wrong, Daniel, but that's perhaps what I take home from your presentation. But speaking of the democratic space, Uganda has just concluded elections, a better part of last year and also part of this year. Of course, we're still having several cases. About 72 cases are in different courts for arbitration. Very many people still contesting the results from there. But in terms of our democracy, we want to analyze and maybe to look at it deeper. Where do we stand as a country in terms of our democratic space? And perhaps we want to build this conversation on this before we can go into the role of social media in either advancing this democratic space or rather limiting it up. And on that note, I perhaps want to, first of all, ask one of our panelists, Nicholas Opio. I'll start with you, Nick. I just wanted to understand, where do we stand as a country in terms of our democratic space and our right to freely express what we feel as a people?
Well, relatives, friends, and in-laws, good morning. When I was invited to this panel, I asked why. I'm just a lawyer in town. As you can see, I think I'm the only lawyer on the panel. But when I saw the list of people, I quickly realized that my role here is to raise the average height of the panelists. So I hope that in so doing this morning, I do not lower the level of intellectual discourse on this panel. Secondly, let me just ask the person in charge of the lights. I was happy when the bright lights were turned on. I'm rather dark. I'm very dark, so if you want to see me, you might actually want to turn on the bright lights. It helps me a lot. I don't think the other guys need it, but I do need it so much. So thank you very much, and good morning. Let me just start by answering what Solomon has asked me to answer. I think that all of us agree that the political trajectory of our country is one that is now generally agreed in so many circles to be democratic in form, but autocratic in substance. We have elections, we have a fairly vibrant civil society, we have a fairly thriving media, but that is only the form. If you look down and look at the substance, I think you'll agree that Uganda is far from a democratic society in substance. It's majorly autocratic. The culture of constitutionalism, we have a constitution without a culture of constitutionalism. So we have a constitution that is just a piece of paper that people in power and those not in power don't seem to respect. In fact, the constitution is more pronounced by its violation as opposed to its respect in so many respects of our lives. Whether you talk about the conduct of the Uganda police force, or indeed the conduct of people in villages who are resorting to mob justice, or indeed the conduct of the court system in this country, will agree with me that the culture of constitutionalism hasn't taken root. We have elected leaders and elections that, in my view, don't necessarily reflect a democratic state or a democratic process. I think many of you were here when elections took place, and you will agree with me that there's a lot of controversy about the elections, and these controversies, well, thank you very much. These controversies still continues. Thirdly, the level of intolerance in this country is very pervasive. Intolerance of people who are critical of the state, intolerance of people who are critical of perhaps government officials or public officials. In fact, in this country, to be called the Management Act, look at the NGO Act recently. Forward and 3 steps backward. But this intolerance is also reflected on the pressure that independent media, if there's any left in this country anyway, that independent media is under in this country. Those of you who work for the Daily Monitor will tell you that the presidential press secretary, not the one who came from the Monitor, the one who was there before, Mr. John Nagenda, is very proud of having exiled, in his word, Daniel Kalinaki and Charles Nyango Bo. So many times the state or the head of state has called the Monitor an enemy of the state. So intolerance towards independent media, and perhaps this is even more felt by FM stations upcountry. The blockade of social media in itself was not a beginning of intolerance, but a continuation of an intolerant state that was, I think, very scared of free expression in times of election. So social media operates within this political context. It cannot be taken in isolation. It must therefore be discussed within this political context. And if we are to do so, we also must look at it within the international context, because we now know that access to broadband, or what you call the internet, has now been declared a fundamental human right, in the same way as the right to education or the right to food or so passed a resolution in which it condemned Uganda. Social media operates within this broader national and political context, but in and of themselves, in the case of Uganda, is a reflection of a continually repressive or intolerant state. And therefore, if you're discussing the impact of social media, perhaps it is important to discuss which one influences the other. Is it social media, or it is the repressive state influencing social media? In my view, I think that the emergence of social media, what I describe as the second liberalization of the media space, has created a lot of discomfort in the state. And because the developments run so fast, the state's ability to control it or to regulate it remain extremely low, and their reaction, therefore, is to prosecute people, is to lock up folks who are arguing online, or indeed to close social media as a whole entirely. And this has happened not just in Uganda, but across the continent and across the world.
Nicholas Appiah, thank you very much. Well, let me just involve Rosebell. Well, you just heard from Nick that social media can only thrive in a place or in a democracy that perhaps is tolerant to it. In just a space of 6 months, we had 2 social media shutdowns. Just the other day, I think, when pictures were all over showing police officers beating people on the road, And this video went viral, and people continue to speak loud of, you know, the kind of impunity that the police was trying to put out there. The IGP General Kale Kayihura came out and said the media was unfair. They did not show police officers, people stoning police officers. They only showed the police officers beating people. Where does that leave us as a nation? And where perhaps do we strike a thin line between our ability to speak what's happening vis-a-vis the current governance in the country?
Thank you, Solomon. That's really, really good question, but I wanted to pick up from Nicholas. Mostly, he talked about the state and its role in the current democracy, the lack of democracy we have. But also, for me, what is critical is the non-existence of the civic awareness of people's rights, because people who don't know their rights are not likely to go out and demand or put pressure on their government. So when you look around and you ask yourself how many Ugandans are aware of their own rights, and how many do actually know what the state is supposed to do for them. A lot of the times we see people kneeling and thanking leaders, actually, and we think we have to think very careful about that, because people don't realize that the state, they pay taxes, and the state is supposed to play its duty, but not to extend their rights as favors. Rights are rights. So I think it's a two-way street, the state, what the state is doing, but also what the communities, whether they understand the state as we know it. Uganda is not many years old, so I think we still have a long way for Ugandans to understand their rights, and that's where also most of the problems are as we interact with the state system. Having said that, about the police brutality, I think that General Kayihura is, trying to swim against the currents of social media, because it was very easy a few years ago to blame Daily Monitor, to blame NBS or NTV about the coverage of a certain issue, but it's no longer easy to actually lay blame on media entirely, because people were there, people capture, people have become, social media has kind of given people the liberty to be, they can actually create content, they can watch what is going on in their community, they can give us these pictures. So the pictures we have from these scenes are not only from the media. So I think it's really, you're swimming against the current, that people are not only listening to media, but people were there, they experienced this, and they have social media, they have WhatsApp. Right now, WhatsApp is the fastest way of Ugandans sharing their information. So you don't need you don't have to wait for Daily Monitor to tell you this happened. People who are there are already telling the story. So I think it's much harder to do propaganda in this age where people are actually there and you have multiple sources. So I would say that that he's actually swimming against the current. He has to calm down, to know that you have to accept many times when violations have been committed, and try to find solutions to them.
Well, if General Kale Kayihura was here, then I'm sure he would have reacted back to your comment. But let me just bring in Patience Akumu. Patience, we know that while the police is continuing to struggle, and by the way, maybe I can put it right, several stories come through and you get calls from the security circles, do not put that online, do not put that on, of course they see that the social media is a force to reckon with. Certainly, just like Daniel Kalinaki was saying, it is a force, but should we as a nation keep in this virtual feel as a country, or should that and go into civic action or civic engagement with the powers that be? And
like we lawyers perspective. Now, what There is action as opposed to the situation of euphoria that we had maybe 6 months ago prior to elections, and there was all this hope that perhaps there will be change, or maybe not exactly at the highest level, but at mid-levels, at lower levels, there is going to be change. And this period is where we saw the laws that Nicholas Opio has been talking about, the Anti-Homosexuality Act, the Anti-Pornography Act, the Public Order Management Act, and all these laws were a reaction of the government to curb this euphoria, to make sure that the space is less and that Ugandans are going to be under control, and for the government to be seen to do certain things that probably the public will appreciate. That was especially in terms of the morality laws, the Anti-Homosexuality Act and the Anti-Pornography Act. And back to what Solomon you asked, does this mean that social media is it? Does this mean that we do not need to go beyond social media in order to have civic action? I would say that social media is but a drop in a big, big ocean of civic action. All of you know that only a few of us are on social media, and even the government knows this, and usually we are not the biggest targets, even though every now and then we are the biggest targets, are the people who are going to go out there and organize themselves and riot and you know, assemble. Every time we make noise on social media, the reaction is that these are elites. And the question for that we elites, as they call us, is, are we able to translate our social media our social media words, our activism into real civic action? Like
much, Mrs. Akomu. Now, I want to really put you in a tight. Just after Minister Frank Tumweba's officials to really go online and Twitter of President Yoweri Museveni that shuts down social media anytime they want, closing, you know, the space that Ugandans perhaps would have used to speak in the first place. Do you think, as a government officer, government was right to shut down social media 2 times in 6 months, and aren't you shooting yourself in the foot?
Okay, thank you. I am happy to represent the minister. By the way, he has sent me 2 messages following what we are doing here. So it's a good day. I like talking to people. Good question. Elections, all the people, the Electoral Commission. I think yesterday, actually, 2 more MPs were thrown out of Parliament, including, I think, 1 for Ginger. That's one thing for me that gives me faith that the laws are working, and that even our courts, Nicholas, you are a lawyer. Yesterday, I think it was Honorable Nathan Igeme Nabeta, and another MP, I think, from Mayuge. They were thrown out. So what we really need is to keep discussing and take our democracy to the next level. But Solomon, you did talk about the clamping down, what you have called the clamping down on social media. Colleagues, I need to say that I am not a security expert, and I don't know whether my colleagues from police are here, but I do work with them, and even that time they told me that there was a security threat. I don't know the details, but what I need to say is that we certainly, all of us, are consumers of security in this country. Just imagine there were bullets flying outside there. Probably we wouldn't be here to discuss social media. So, and sometimes, of course, you cannot know exactly the nature of the threat. Sometimes you think it is a threat, maybe it's not a threat. Sometimes you might think it's not a big threat when it is actually a big threat. Here in Uganda, we've tested it. You remember, unfortunately, in 2010, at Lugogo, the rugby club. You know what happened there? There was Kabaragala. Earlier, the older people, you remember, I think it was in 1998 or 97 or thereabout, there were various explosions in different parts of the city. So I would rather we support our security people to do what they do so that all of us have a good environment to do what we do. Social media users, but also even people who do business, the private sector, civil society, even the media. We need a peaceful environment for us to flourish and do what we do. But talking about social media, Solomon, recently you saw, ladies and gentlemen, the president merged two ministries. I think you are aware about that. Myself, actually, we are in the process of putting together the two ministries. One of the reasons, those who don't have that letter, I can send it to you. I have it in my phone here. The president says he wants to ensure that there are better synergies between ICT and the management and of dissemination of information in Uganda. And he specifically, by the way, explicitly talks about social media. He wants to see us using social media even much better. And I can tell you, this is one area, Daniel, that even ourselves think we should improve. We have not been doing well. I have been in the ministry for about 4 years, and I realize, my friend Julius knows, us who left university in about 1995, that time there was no social media. So currently, we are actually pressing our communication officers. Julius knows, and possibly he will touch on this. All of them, we require that they develop social media accounts. Myself, I am finally on also, I'm glad to say that.
We're glad
So
we're glad you're
Yes,
on social media. Is it Twitter, Facebook, what?
Yes, I'm on Twitter. I'm
What
on
is your Twitter handle?
and it feels very good. It's he said it is sexy, but I think it's also cool. So we are adapting to the trends, and we think this is the way to go as government, because Solomon, you gave us the figures earlier. If we are not engaging with is it 11 million, then we are leaving out a lot of people, because government is about giving information, but also hearing from your people. The service delivery that Daniel talked about, it's certainly not excellent. And I think we've heard the president saying that this time it's going to be business unusual.
Business.
I work with the government, and I can tell you, people are already feeling the discomfort. Us, ourselves, commissioners, we've been on permanent terms, but within, I think, about 6 months, we'll be on 3-year contracts. So this, the engagement, information management, it cannot be separated from the process of democracy and the growth of a state. You saw Kaguta challenge, it did go viral. I think I saw.
To you, Moses, in just a short bit. And I think you bring forward very, very interesting freedom of expression. Well, government, if social media is going to be shut down.
Well, thank you very much. If we are to believe look at what the IGP swore in support of President Museveni's case in the discretion of a person so discredited as the IGP, what happened bombing in Chadondo and at the Ethiopian restaurant? He's talking about security. All these threats are thrown at you to scare you. But let's pause a bit and step back and look at this overall question of security. I think all of you here read newspapers. You know that the IGP has declared before names, dates, and time in which opposition people had gone to Somalia, gone to Iraq for training, and they had returned to come and bomb this country. We forget easily. We have never held him to account for that. The point is, they are susceptible to lies. They are susceptible to manipulation. Thirdly, human rights are not absolute. Certain rights can be derogated, but there are conditions for derogation. I think many of us have read into Article 43 of the Constitution, which allows for limits of derogation as an excuse for derogation. But in fact, what is provided for in Article 43 are further restrictions from derogations. I'll share with you a report here by the UN Special Rapporteur on the freedom of association, essentially outlining 4 major steps to be taken before internet freedoms, including social media, can be interrupted. The first, he says, that there must be specific conditions, must leave no doubt as to the specificity of the threat that would justify the curtailment of the rights of expression online. In this case, the commissioner claims, he just admits he had no idea what it was. It wasn't specific, it's just a phone call from Ewan Kale Kaihura. Secondly, he says that blocking social media or indeed internet must be justified and must be in pursuance of a specific aim provided for in law. Okay? It cannot be arbitrary and the exercise of just an individual. Thirdly, he says the justification provided must have a nexus to the action taken. And then lastly, he talks about the question of proportionate measures. So you ask yourself, were these measures proportionate? Were they lawful? Were they legitimate? Did they address a specific threat? The answer is no.
Well, Nick, actually, when you look at the way the different telecom companies addressed it, they did write subscribers saying, our dear subscribers, we have gotten instruction.
Those processes were opaque, were political in nature for our access. Facebook can, on its own right, switch you off, can, in its own right, suspend your account. So technology is not neutral. It is not democratic. The question then should be, how can we, these service providers, these technology companies, or in the exercise of their other prejudices or whatever it may be, they act within the law? Because I think that while we talk about access to internet being a human right, there's a whole question about what that means for service providers. Take, for example, the question of privacy. I don't know how many of you have posted pictures of yourselves at the beach in a bikini, breasts, thighs, and things like that. So the question is, technology itself is not neutral, whatever you do. So I think we need to be aware that technology is not neutral. It is subject to business interests of these companies and of service providers. In Uganda, MTN, Smile, or whoever you buy your data bundle from.
Well, I'm sure that if no one comes up against this whole telecom company saying we've gotten instructions, the next day UCC boss Mutabazi will just pick up a call and say, hey, can you shut that down? And they will, of course, give us another, we are sorry, we've been instructed. But just that's food for thought for us to think about it. And Rosebell, social media seems to be providing an opportunity for us to speak our hearts out. Whatever you want to speak, yeah? Express the way you feel about anyone or what's going on in the country. But then government equally finds itself between a rock and a hard place, between how to manage some of these comments that come through. Some of them almost tilted towards hate speech, others like nudity, and perhaps sometimes we've seen several arrests being made, including one journalist who was arrested for putting a post up on Facebook in Kasese. But government finds itself in this delicate position. How then should government ensure that the views of people which are put out there keep up, but also keeping a keen eye on what people post?
Thank you, Solomon. I think we have to take it seriously. What Daniel says, that what is online is an extension of what is going on offline, because the suppression of people's opinions has not just begun in Uganda. If you remember, we used to have Ebimeza, very lively talk shows where ordinary people could come and argue out their points and discuss what was trending in the week. Before social media, we had Ebimeza, so people expressing themselves online is an extension of what they had already been doing. And we also saw I think Kayunga riots, at the end of the day, we saw the banning of Ebimeza, and we kind of accepted it and never really challenged, and people found newer voices, I think, online. I think that the role of that is to actually facilitate conversations, not to control the conversations. the laws that apply offline, hate speech, I don't know, inciting violence, can be also extended to offline. It's just like whether you use a radio or TV, you could also cause harm by, you know, using Twitter. We have seen thousands of Twitter accounts by ISIL, you know. It's mobilizing online. So it's a place where many things can take place. But I don't think that
their processes are, and I'm just share our data with. Facebook is free. It is not free. Facebook.
there are twist people arrested on terrorism charges, treason charges that never hold any water. So as long as these things are already still happening offline, these kinds of charges can be used online. As long as you're a person of interest for the state, they could use any law, like pornography. You know, a lot of Ugandans were some of them were in support of anti-pornography bill, but they don't understand the implications of anti-pornography bill on expression, on media freedom. The fact that a newspaper can be closed down for a photo that the government wants to interpret as pornography. The fact that you, as a person, like Nicholas is saying, online, you could actually be arrested for a certain photo. You know, these are constant struggles, but I think at the end of the day, if the government is not in these spaces, we saw Minister Tumwebaze say that President Museveni had directed that, you know, cabinet ministers should be online. We really don't need directives for that to be happening. If we understood the job and the role of social media as a country, as a government, that shows that our government is still really behind in terms of understanding how social media works. And that's why their default function is go for the switch and switch of social media. So as if the government understood very well, and if it participated very well if it was in the arena, in the social media, then they would not be looking to cut off social media. They will be looking to put their own information and compete with the different narratives.
Well, I will leave that to the people sometimes to talk back. But just before I come back to our audience, I think one of the things that stands out is, should then government start looking or embracing the views of Ugandans that come through social media as a voice that shouldn't be ignored, but rather given an ear? I want to bring in Patience on that.
Okay, yes, certainly, Solomon and the audience, the views that come in on social media, like as so many people have rightly observed, are the views are views that come from down sometimes, because while we are the elites on social media, we live in a very close-knit society. We live in a society where the one educated person is supporting maybe 20 other people back in the village. What this means is that we have influence over their views, and they have influence over their views, and we interact, and every now and then the views that you see on social media are actually the views of the people who are the views of Ugandans who may not be able to express themselves. And we cannot underscore the role of these few voices on social media that, you know, in many cases speak for most. Linked to the question of what is acceptable in a truly democratic society, and just how much government should come in and curtail these voices or support these voices and try to stream out which voices they want. I think over and above what Nicholas said on paper and what the law says and what the international instruments say about curtailing freedoms and what is acceptable in a free and democratic society, media people will tell you that we have feelers as human beings. We know that we know what is out there. We know the opinions that are out there even before we are told. In the same vein, I will say we know what is free and democratic even before we are told, even before we go and list them down and the laws. And the question to ask right now is, was what happened during elections and in the post-election period acceptable to us as human beings? Were our feelers telling us that this was something that was free and democratic? And yes, it is very applaudable that government is now going out to sanction the same social media that they closed down, and clearly it's being seen from, like Moses pointed out, the Museveni challenge, and there is the government has now put out its feelers to know that there is a lot of tension in the country, and that the people spoke sometimes through social media, and that this is an important forum, and there is an attempt for government to just use this forum and to neutralize the space through humor, Museveni on Twitter, but this should not distract us from the important role of social media in building democracy. This should not distract us from asking Moses whether their approaches towards reconstructing social media is going to carry behind the poor, because experience has shown us that from fiscal policies to commercialization of farming and other interventions, many times the poor Ugandans are left behind. Many times interventions usually worsen the inequality gap, and while we've seen the paradox of growth across Africa without changing realities for most Africans. So Moses, it would be good to hear from you if these are things you've taken into consideration, or if you are enjoying the sexiness of social media without it translating into real voices. Thank
Absolutely, Moses, you just had that. So, I think, one of the things I think also to add on finally from you, Moses, social media, people speak how they feel about something. I have received a lot of bashing, by the way, some negative comments coming through here and there, and I accept that these are comments from people. I mean, not everyone agrees with your opinion, and I think this is where government is sometimes getting it wrong, that when perhaps someone speaks how they feel about something, they are turned into a public enemy, number one. Take, for example, we all know the Tom Volte or Kwalinga story, often speaking, giving his views and opinion on some of these things, and perhaps if you follow his Facebook page, putting government to account on a number of things. Well, we all have different opinions on Tom Volte or Kwalinga, but I know that government, for example, sanctioned a search for him, who he is and all that, and there are all these things going around. So is it time, Moses, that you started accepting diverging opinions on what government wants to put out there, but also you could respond to Patience's question?
Okay, thank you again, Solomon. Maybe just briefly again, let me touch on what a colleague, the lawyer, Nicholas. Thank you, Nicholas, for reminding me. Now, members, like I said, the security, I'm not an expert, I cannot claim to be. But if you have been around international airports, even ours in Entebbe, they can irritate you, not so. But they are doing their job. And I know when social media was shut down, I think for 3 or 4 days, it did inconvenience people. Even ourselves in government were actually inconvenienced. We use the internet, we use social media. So it did inconvenience as much as it inconvenienced other social media users in the country. And I believe that's why the closure was meant to be as temporary as possible. About what Nicholas talked about, that why was it happening at this time when we had elections? But I also know that we are not entirely cushioned from insecurity just because we are having an election. That's why I said sometimes security issues are better left to the people who manage security. You saw people who are watching on TV when His Excellency went to Kigali. You saw what happened to some of his people? Yes, but that is security. They had to let the security people in Rwanda do their job. But I think the security people were doing their job, like I've said. About social media, my belief is that social media does build bridges. We are talking about building bridges today. It does, and that's why you see Julius there. I think about a quarter of his job is about managing the social media sites and tools for the Prime Minister, the President, the First Lady, all these people. In fact, if Honorable Frank was here, he likes to joke. He was going to say even Honorable Philemon Mateke is on social media now. You know him, Honorable Mateke? Yes, he's on social media. But like I said, we realize we need to up our game. That is why the president merged the ministries. The problem with social media is the absence of gatekeeping. I think, Daniel, you know that. There was recently a story about the supposed death of former president of Kenya, His Excellency Daniel Arap Moi. Did you see it? For about a day, information was flying around that His Excellency Arap Moi was dead, until he actually tweeted himself to say that I am not dead. We know our local celebrities here in Uganda, they spend a lot of time trading insults on social media. So the problem with content on social media sometimes is, do we know it is true? How far is it true? Or should people defame and slander each other? And you know, it goes on and on and on. I was reading about a celebrity who broke up with, I think, a boyfriend. And they went on, even now. They are going on and on. I think that's the challenge with social media. And probably that's why we need to discuss how we should manage it. It's very good, certainly, instant information, feedback, and others. For my neighbor here, just next to the right, the Ministry of ICT has a program called the Rural Communication Development Fund. It runs under UCC. The sole purpose of that program is to take ICT services, the internet, and even capacity for social media all around the country. Because as we know, like Daniel said, for now, it's mainly elitist, people with degrees, diplomas, MBAs, I don't know what. But if we are going to transform this country, we need a critical mass of people. And information is at the heart of transformation. So, so that program, hopefully, it will ensure that internet and social media does trickle down to the last man on the ground. And smartphones, they are becoming cheaper. I think the cheapest now is about, it's even less than 200,000. So why not? Why shouldn't we have our people, even in the country, on social media? That way, we get as much information as we can around the country. And us as a government, we do cherish feedback. Even when we are criticized, by the way, it's very good for people to criticize you because it helps you to see the other perspective. Where are these people coming from? Maybe there's something you are not doing right. So you get criticized and reflect and hopefully do better. And I think if you see the new cabinet, don't you see you people that the people who have been criticizing, some of them the president is actually drawing them closer. So maybe there's something he did appreciate about them. Thank you.
Thank you. Rosebel, in a second, you want to make a reaction to that?
I wanted to kind of pick up some of the, from his comments. I think when you say rural, programs, it's very important to tell us what are these programs really, what are the interventions that you're putting, because the problem is that the government is fixated on political issues, the use of social media for people to express themselves, rather than, expanding, internet for people to be online in order to further, economic participation in the economy, because these economies right now are driven by data and information. And if most of our country is not on the internet, then we will actually still be behind. But that said, we must realize that Ugandans are not only online trading insults. People have had good conversations and with humor. We saw 1986 photos, pictures making international headlines. Ugandans actually used the moment to mark the 30th, NRM, Victory, Liberation Day, whatever it's called. To actually show where they were. And we're in a country where, 70% of our population is below the age of 30. And it was amazing to see the gap between those who are leading and those who are being led, and the majority of Ugandans. So when you find the opinions online, most of the young people are online expressing themselves, and maybe they're not fully represented in the circles. The other day we were shocked to see pictures from the ICT ministry with all men panel here talking about ICT and development, which was really a shame, because I think there are women in that ministry or even in this country who are capable of talking about ICT. So these are the key issues we need to see, rather than talking about only politics, because we are here to see social transformation, not only just politics. So it's really important to hear what you're actually doing to make sure the conversation is not just Kampala based, but beyond.
Moses.
Solomon, this program has been running, I think, for about 3 years now. What happens is that through UCC, the government is providing cheap equipment, computers, even tablets to rural schools.
Could you, for clarification, help us with that? Maybe the examples of these rural schools which have received tablets?
I am not from UCC, I can tell you, but we are online here. And Solomon, you are a journalist. If you talk to my friend Fred Otunu, he's the corporate affairs manager at UCC, he can give you a whole report on what has been done so far. And like I said, the colleagues, I am not here to hide anything. At first I said, we know we are not doing well with social media. And I think learning starts when you do acknowledge that you have a problem somewhere. These changes I talked about, the president wouldn't have merged two ministries. Read the letter. He mentions social media. And he talks about sensitizing people about government programs. And he says, in fact, he says, permanent secretaries, accounting officers are also going to be assessed about how well they do communicate. So back to Rosebell, I know some work has been done. They actually do train Rosebell. They train women, they train students. They even have simplified programs for people who cannot speak English, like us gathered here. Solomon, I challenge you, talk to Fretunu, tell him I have referred you to him. He's going to give you a full report, what they have done, and where they are going next. So it's not ideal, but some progress I know is being made to ensure that the ICT revolution does not leave out a large mass of the people in this country.
Many thanks, Moses Watasa, there answering some of those questions. Well, it's time for us to pass the ball across to our audience. If you have any clarification, any opinions that you want to put out there on this subject, I could give you a minute or two to express your views. Yes. Maybe we'll start from the back seat. Ivan Okuda raised his hand.
Thank you, Solomon. Thank you for the intellectually stimulating discussion on the part of the panelists. I'm a student of law at Macquarie University, and I speak as a citizen of Uganda and not as a journalist. The issue of security, I think, is very pertinent because it's important to look at the discussion on human rights versus security in light of what happened when social media was blocked. One of the most liberal judges, Nicholas, you're familiar with, Lord Denning, in a landmark ruling so many years ago, held that when it comes to matters of national security, that which we treasure most, called human rights, takes second place. In fact, even the rules of natural justice might suffer a setback. So across the world, there is every justification, sometimes, even for what is in the latent spirit of the law to be violated, if that will cure a security crisis. The tragedy we have, in my humble view, is that we do not have national security informing the actions of the men and women who run this country. It is rather regime security. The actions of the IGP and the UCC executive director were never to do with national security. They were everything to do with the political contestation at play and everything to do with protecting the unwritten job description of General Kaihura, the regime, the interest of the president, and ensuring that the election was, the election atmosphere was managed well. So, Mr. Watasa, Ugandans are fairly awake and alive to these realities. So when you throw the national security argument around, national security should not be a magic wand to violate the most basic of freedoms. So I think it's an important distinction to make. Regime security versus national security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will get to the other side. Yes, then maybe I can come back later here. I'll pick a lady. If there's a lady that side. Okay, then
Hi,
of course
the lady's here. I have the mic.
Okay, we'll start with the one who held the mic first. Yes.
So my question is to Mr. Watasa. I think, of course, national security is an important thing. And you've asked us to trust the security agencies. And in fact, we did trust them because they turned off social media and nobody rioted on the streets. So that's an expression of trust. You made a decision, you executed against it. But trust has to have feedback. So now that we trusted you, can you actually go back and find out what national security crisis was averted? Because you cannot 6 months we trust you and we let that act. So in fact, Bob was communicating via WhatsApp. It can always, we can't just trust you in a vacuum.
Moses, I think you're taking notes. Okay, so I will pick
Solomon, just a request. Could you please introduce yourselves before you make a contribution? Thank you.
Would I highly appreciate that. Well, I'll get a comment from one person that side. Oh, there's a lady there. Okay, please.
Thank you so very much for being for that consideration. A very great panel discussion. I'm Florence Odong. Social media is very good, very constructive. But for any beautiful thing, there's also the ugly. Now, for us to maximize the benefits, I just request us to carry out some regulation, protectionism, and safeguards. And especially when I talk of protectionism, our young ones getting exposed. But all in all, social media is a great mechanism. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your contribution. Again, I'll pick one hand from that side.
Thank you so much, Mr. Solomon Suruwanje. My name is Obed Katurebe, and I'll put my question to Nicholas Opio, because the first person to sue social media is a fellow lawyer, Fred Muwema, during the last elections. I think that's the first Ugandan so far. And I will not want to hide around. I have my reservations, much as the social media revolution has really caused tremendous change in communication. But the issue of security is not Uganda's case alone. It's a global challenge. I think countries like UK and US are even mulling the idea of how much they can control, because the critical component of journalism, which is gatekeeping, has been thrown to the dogs. Now, I want Nicholas Opio to guide us on how we can tame criminal individuals, and I would prefer to call them criminal individuals, who will wake up in the morning, call Mr. Opio a killer, a thief, and however much you'll go back and write back, the damage may not be controllable. I would want probably some experts seated in front of us to share views on the other side as well of criminal people with criminal intentions hiding in ghost identification and causing damage to society. I think that's where government is having a challenge, and it's not Uganda's case alone. I'm saying it's a global challenge, and like I've said from my preliminary observations, the first person to sue social media is a Ugandan and not a government official, but a lawyer who was representing a key opposition politician. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that question. We'll pick one more question here. I think that's John. Yes, then maybe you, then we can go that, then we can come in. John is right there.
Okay, I'm John Birungi, Babirukamu. Just a few stats for me to say. Okay, I'm a social media analyst. If you look at Facebook in Uganda, it has 2.4 million users. Facebook is the largest social media platform in Uganda, as opposed to 14 million users who are on the internet. Now, of those 1.4 in Greater Kampala, that's Kampala, Mukono, Wakiso, Mpigi, 70% of them are 30 years and below of the 2.4 million. Now, what does this translate for government, for things like elections? I said recently, when we were in the election period, that if someone is to look at how to use social media properly, they can win 10% of the electorate. 10% of the electorate, that's 1.5 million people who are on social media, who are on Facebook. That's just looking at Facebook. But what instead did we see? Candidates ignoring social media. Instead, the biggest person during the last elections, if I look at it, was Tuonge. Tuonge was the most effective political entity. And I think that is what government needs to pick a leaf from. I'm just giving my opinion. You need to go back and study what Tuonge did. What they did was set up a social media monitoring center. You need to, instead of switching off social media, you need to have listening tools for you to know. If someone's saying turumbe, that kind of thing and whatnot, you can monitor. And also one thing that government needs to understand is that terrorists never post on social media that they're going to attack. They always do it after the attack, boasting about it. So, but at the same time, if I see a Kavera lying somewhere or something and I tweet about it, government can use that as information to then act. Just as a cue, I'll give you. Sometime back, there was a minister, I don't know which, so a minister of state. He was driving a UG with a Z at the end. The driver was being very silly, driving on the wrong side of Acacia Avenue and causing traffic jam. So I tweeted it and put with a picture, and I put Uganda police, and police said they are going to handle it. So after consistent poking and poking of police, is like, what happened? So now they tell me the driver was actually fined. That's an example of somebody who is apparently too big to follow the rules being brought down by a citizen. So government needs to look at it. Police has started seriously taking social media seriously, although I doubt their IGP takes it as seriously as the communications people. But it is something that government needs to wake up to.
Many thanks, John. One more, last one. The gentleman in orange, is that orange or something? Oh, you have the mic. Okay, you have a second.
Thank you so much. I'll be brief as a cock. My name is Muzira Tony Johnson, and it goes to Nicholas Opio. It is about mainly Facebook. We need to know, for example, my brother talked about Fred Mwema when he went to courts of law about Facebook. It was about Tom Okwalinga posting something like that. So we need to know what are kind of the laws that are guiding Facebook, because as young people, I'm representing young people here, we are normally affected, we are addicted to social media. So then the other issue, it was about elections. When social media was cut down, I was one of the young people that participated in elections. I was an election observer. So we had no ways of communicating. People are fighting when people are voting. Honorable can tell you in Uganda it happened. So I found it wise, if social media was there, because I had the number of the IGP, I sent him a message. The police was not doing anything. We reported and they're asking us, are you NRM? I'm telling you it happened. So they were only helping out people of NRM. I'm telling you it happened, I was on ground. So social media was the only thing that I would use to communicate. I think government should, Moses, you should do something about it. Thank you so much.
I had promised the last man to be the man in orange. I think, is that orange or yeah? Gentleman in orange. Behind you.
Well, thank you. This is actually, I think, red. I'm called Magezi Chirinju. I do social media privately. One, I wanted to remind my friend there that if a government, if a party wins in national election, its security becomes national security automatically. So, yeah, security of Obama is security for US. So it's just natural. But me, I wanted Mr. Opio to comment on this. Social media debates in the world and in Uganda as well, they are basically like gun laws in US. You can own a gun in US lawfully, but they are killing people for sure. So the lawyers are like, do we amend this law because people are dying for sure? So social media is good for sure, but because it is for everybody, even the bad guys are there. Now, most critics do not provide what the government should do. Probably government is also confused what to do. All we do is quarrel. So you as lawyers provide what government should do so that it is debated, other than say, no, don't cut us off, but we also have nothing to do in case something goes wrong. It doesn't help in either side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to our panelists before we can wrap it up because we're a bit ahead of schedule. I'll come to Nicholas. You have two or three questions on you. If you could start with reactions.
Attempt to answer them. Mr. Katurebe, in the Government Media Center, asked, how do we deal with criminal elements on Facebook? He in particular mentions, I think, the case of defamation. To the East African Court of Justice to challenge Uganda's law on criminal defamation. There is no place in a democratic society for criminal defamation laws. There are civil procedures that somebody can invoke if they think they have been wronged in matters of speech. The only exceptions are exceptions about hate speech that we now all accept must be prosecuted. But criminal defamation has no place in a democratic society. Secondly, and I want to invite Odreg, and I read your articles in the papers, both in the Red Paper and other places, that you need to read the judgment of Justice Mulenga. In the case of Charles Onyango Bo, Andrew Mujuni Mwenda versus the Attorney General. It is still good law in this country. This is the Supreme Court decision. I think it is the best court decision I've ever read in the last 10 years. Justice Mulenga argues that in a free and democratic society, you must allow even stupid views to be heard. You must allow inconvenient views to be heard. If they report that Odrek is dead, and indeed, if Odrek is not dead, let him come and say, look, I am not yet dead, I'm here. The marketplace of ideas must allow all shades of opinions to come up. Only the weak would fear what they call, criminal statements on Facebook or on social media. So I think let ideas flourish, even the stupid ones. At the pre-conference event, there was a discussion about bullshit. Okay, I think Matthias showed us a documentary about bullshit, and people were saying bullshit is bad, it's going to ruin this world. But I offered my counsel, and I said, I have read a book by John Stuart Mills titled On Liberty, where he argues very strenuously, and I think convincingly, that we must allow all shades of opinions to be heard, because how else would you be convinced of your views unless you know the contrary view? So don't fear being insulted, Audrey. Certainly, if you want to insult me, please do so. And that will not make me upset. So I think the state must focus on enhancing mechanisms for communication as opposed to regulating content of communication. And I think that you can take that message back to the media center, that people will insult Ofonopono for all the things he has done and for all the things he hasn't done. So he shouldn't be upset. Rather, it should engage. So government needs to engage social media as opposed to shut it down and seek to criminalize. I have 9 people who are being prosecuted in court for just posts on Facebook. One of them is, now you know him, he's called Shaka. Shaka Robert is being accused of being TVO. In fact, that's the basis of the Fred Muema case in Ireland against Facebook for disclosure. So let judicial processes take place, but let's not shut down Facebook and close discussion. I'm not so sure I understood the last question, but let me attempt to answer it. And I think that connects with what Ivan has said. Now we need to reflect deeply whether the actions of institutions of state are in actions in public interest or in individual interests. I think increasingly, the actions of many state actors are not even about regime. The victim is a witness in that criminal trial cassette. We shouldn't be stopped from doing that. Lastly, Muzira asked me about laws governing Facebook. I think as opposed to speak about laws governing Facebook, let me speak about the laws that can deal with crimes committed online. Because it is true, people are committing crimes online. People are extorting money. People are involved in dissemination of adult pornography. I think consumption of should be, but child pornography is an offense and people need to crimes. There is no new law to deal with such crimes online. There are no needs for new laws because there are laws that govern pornography, child pornography. There are laws that govern extorting money. There are laws governing electronic evidence, Computer Misuse Act. All these laws are laws that can be invoked to regulate activities that are lawful, that are unlawful on social media. So we need to reflect on that. What we need to do in terms of legislation is to ensure free access or increase access to broadband to citizens to be able to express themselves. Because access to broadband, as I said at the beginning, is now a fundamental human right. But in conclusion, let me just say 2 things. One, social media is a big bar. Okay, many of you who drink, I don't, go to a bar and have excellent discussions. Some of you are most brilliant when you're drinking. It's just a Marua joint. It's a discussion point. I think we shouldn't focus on the discussion point, but what informs those discussions. Those discussions are normally incited or are provoked by what happens in society. Secondly, don't overrate social media in terms of penetration. In my view, local language FM stations are more powerful than social media. The poor woman in my village selling tomatoes has a small radio listening to the news. So local FM as a means for influencing people's opinions across the country in terms of numbers and in terms of reach. So perhaps you want to focus on that. Lastly, don't focus on shutdown. Shutdown is just a very small bit of them.